So next up, I would like to invite up to the stage Themistoklis Pantazakos, who is going to present on designing neurodiversity-affirmative mental health interventions for autism. I'd just like to draw your attention again to the trigger warnings here. There will be discussion on death and dying, self-harm, mental illness and suicide. Thank you. Welcome, Themi.
Hi, thank you very much. I've seen excellent presentation design skills today, so I'll have to apologize for my more boring approach. I'm here to talk to you about the pilot of a program we ran out of KU Leuven. For the moment, I and Melissa Fua, in the future more colleagues. So my presentation fits well with the previous one. Indeed, autistic people are more likely to suffer from virtually every major psychiatric disorder, about 20% more regarding anxiety disorders, 11% for depression disorders, 9% for OCD. Autistic people are at about 2.5 times more likely to die prematurely compared to the general population. 31%, a staggering number, of those deaths is due to suicide compared to 4% in the general population, which are really, really worrying numbers. Now, psychotherapy, my field of research expertise, is a powerful tool against these disorders for the general population, but it cannot at any rate be assumed to just work for autistic people, at least not in its default modes, as it's heavily communication-based, and autistic communication is, well, different, especially between an autistic client and a neurotypical therapist, which I think we can safely take to be the norm. There's recently been, with the advent of the neurodiversity movement, some interest in what psychotherapy for autistic people should mean. That is, it's only recently that we thought that these problems are less likely to be due to autism itself, and more likely they need to be addressed in their own regard. There's a few problems, or if you will, gaps with this recent bunch of research that we have identified. The first one is that most of that research regards the background conditions for therapy. For example, spelling out the process or providing sensory accommodations, which is very useful and very valuable in and of itself, but it does not address arguably the core of the therapeutic interaction, the relationship, the interaction itself. The second one is that recommendations are sometimes virtue signaling and kind of vague. They're not very actionable. And most of that research is single point preference polling. That means that most often therapists and less often clients are once asked about what they like or what they do in therapy, and that's taken to constitute advice. And there's many problems with that. One of them is that therapists, for example, do not necessarily do the correct thing, but also that both therapists and clients do not necessarily have a good insight of what's going on in therapy or what's working in therapy. So we argue, more sophisticated measures and ways of researching what is actually to be done within psychotherapy for autistic clients. So the present project innovates in two ways. First, it targets the therapeutic interaction itself, and second, it goes beyond the standard outcome measures to adapted outcome measures, such as those coming out of the Aspire, I don't know how you pronounce it, program, to track lived experience across time and to use quantified measures appropriate to autism. This is just the pilot version, so I'm not going to show you the full extent of this. For this version of the program, we had interviews with 16 autistic clients of psychotherapy, 16 therapists, and sometimes they were paired in dyads. So we had interviews with the autistic person and their psychotherapist to cross-reference their respective perceptions of what went on in their therapy. And now I'm going to present the most interesting, I think, findings during the course of the study. So starting with the problems that people presented with, as we say, came in with, most common was depression, and overwhelmingly common was a difficulty of connecting with others, difficulty forming personal relationships, loneliness, in all of its forms, as the previous presentation emphasized as well. Relatively common issues were also anxiety, suicidality, and trauma. The modalities followed closely resembled more or less that of the general population. Most did integrative psychotherapy, about a half did CBT, and some couples therapy. About 60% of the modalities that autistic clients tried, they evaluated as helpful. Now, what's interesting here is that what was most helpful and kind of upsetting to me, as I've had my main psychotherapeutic training in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, that the most helpful thing was addressing practical problems in the here and the now, and especially following techniques that aimed at the body, widely construed. So, for example, EMDR or mindfulness, or techniques that got one in touch with their own body. Open-ended reflection stuff that went into the past and in a kind of more loosely defined and structured way, I will come back to this point, were significantly less evaluated as helpful. Now, what seemed to be helpful, not in terms of modality, but in terms of like actual things you do in psychotherapy, approaches, and so on, was for most people unpacking disability. What does it mean to be autistic? What does it mean to be disabled in some ways? In which ways am I different to others? Co-exploring their autistic identity and solidifying it. And again, surprisingly to me, explaining social situations, as in the therapist explaining a given social situation from a neurotypical point of view. And it was interesting that several people mentioned that they found this useful to decide if they were going to mask or not. In some cases, they seem to think that masking served their self-interest, their interest as they perceived it, which sort of moves us away from this binary of masking bad, non-masking good. Maybe sometimes some flexibility, like giving agency to the person to decide for themselves what they want to present us, is even better for them. A close second was psychoeducation, especially on emotions. What are the basic emotions, how to identify them, how to experience them, and including from a brain point of view. Also, a few mentioned facilitating a strong therapeutic alliance and trust, which of course begs the question of how to do that. We of course don't expect the clients themselves to explain this, but it's a point we want to press on to the future, in the future. As regards obstacles, three themes. One was loosely defined structure. For example, abstract communication, no clearly set goals or instructions, and unstructured process. Second, and here we call back to the psychoanalytic point before, a passive therapist, a so-called blank screen therapist, did not seem to be helpful at all. It provoked a feeling of being lost, of not knowing how to proceed, as did things happening implicitly without being spelled out. And the third major theme was when therapy focused on masking, when it made masking explicitly the focus of therapy, pushing the limits of autistic people to the point of meltdown and beyond. This is perhaps the most unsurprising find. But generally, it seemed that the therapeutic process got stuck when autistic people felt lost, as in lost in how to proceed, what to do next, what to share, where is the juice of the process, and pressured into going beyond what they were comfortable doing. As in lived experience changes, when these changes were evaluated as positive, they involved, in agreement with the problems identified before, improved communication and connection to others, conflict management, setting boundaries, feeling emotions, being able to experience emotions, especially in the dimension of gradients, not a none on very much kind of situation, a binary situation. And a lot reported ability to making major life decisions, like moving, changing jobs, getting married, and overall increased autonomy, capacity to make decisions for themselves, and self-acceptance and self-love. So these are the first conclusions of the pilot. This is a summary of the findings, and hopefully, if things with funding go well, we will be able to tackle this from a much more comprehensive point of view. Thank you very much.
So we have time for a question, if anybody wants to come forward to ask a question at this stage from Themi.
Hi, thank you for your very insightful presentation. I wanted to ask you, since you have a background in psychodynamic psychotherapy, if you do see some space for developing adaptation of psychodynamic-based, more manualized and structured models that see the psychotherapist as a more active figure, such as mentalization-based treatment that can be maybe adapted to autistic clients.
The short answer is I'm not sure, because I don't know that structured psychodynamic psychotherapy is still psychodynamic psychotherapy. It's the assumption of open-endedness and loose connectionism is at the core of psychodynamic psychotherapy. So I don't know to the extent where you can violate that and still keep the same modality. But it's an interesting question.
Thank you sincerely, Themi. That was most interesting, and we look forward to hearing more details about your work in due course.